Well, greetings everyone and welcome. My name is Tim Kies and you are listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. And you can listen to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. And I'm sure glad to have you here with us tonight. Always remember, there's plenty of great shows on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, and you can listen to my show, God Save the King, and all these other great shows by going to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, which is simply www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. But there's plenty of other great ways to listen to all these shows. You can use your Alexa, Google, or Apple home devices and simply say, hey, play God Save the King or play Truth Be Told Radio Network. And you can do that with your Android app, with MyTuner, Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn radio on those home devices. Any smart device will get you connected to the Truth Be Told Radio Network and God Save the King. And of course, you can also simply call in on your phone. You can dial 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977 to listen to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. So as I am recording this, okay, so now I am recording this on Thursday, December 2nd, and it's going to air tomorrow night on Friday, December 3rd, which means we are in the season of the year where everybody, quote unquote, celebrates the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, even though he was not born at this time. And, I need to remind everyone here that it's not really my intention to wreck people's traditions. And yet again, at the same time, when those traditions are built on faulty premises, it doesn't really bother me that much if I do. It's not really, it's like I said, it's not intentional, not trying to hurt your feelings, not trying to upset you, not trying to make you feel bad, anything like that. I'm just very excited about when Jesus really was born, as opposed to when he wasn't born. And the fact that there's so much truth, frankly, so much truth and so much weight behind the real story as opposed to the traditional story. And the fact that over 35 years of research, to me, it's just not debatable anymore that he was not born on December 25th. And it's just really hard for me personally to get excited about that anymore, right? I've quoted this before, the famous quote that says, the heart cannot rejoice in what the mind rejects as being false, right? So if you're carrying around cognitive dissonance up here, very hard to rejoice down here. Now, for those of you listening on the radio, I was pointing to my head and then pointing to my heart. Very hard to carry around cognitive dissonance in your brain, in your mind, in your head, and then somehow manage to rejoice and believe in your heart that Jesus was born on December 25th. And therefore, somehow I'm supposed to get all excited when it's not the right time of the year. Okay, so that sounds kind of funny because, like I keep saying, I'm not trying to ruin your fun. That's not the point here. I just really get excited about when Jesus really was born. So what I want to do tonight is I want to share some pieces of information that I really haven't had the chance to get to yet, but they are additional pieces of evidence that help us determine when Jesus was born. Now, I've got to admit, part of this was prompted by the fact that I was online the other day and I was looking at a post that was posted on social media, and it was there defending a December 25th birthday. Okay. And I read through it, and to be blunt, I wasn't very impressed. Okay, because the emphasis was basically, what difference does it make? Okay, well, it makes an enormous difference. And over the years, I've had many people challenge me saying, well, prove to me that he was not born on December 25th. Well, you know what? I actually don't have to do that. If you think he was born on December 25th, you need to prove to me that he was born on December 25th, because the Bible does not say he was born on December 25th, and it doesn't matter how long you have been practicing the incorrect date. That doesn't make it right, okay? We all know that it doesn't matter if something is incorrect. Repeating it dozens or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or millions of times doesn't make a false fact correct, simply because you've repeated it several million times. That doesn't change it, okay? And what I'm driving at here is the simple fact that if you start with a blank slate and simply go where the evidence leads, it will not lead you to December 25th. It will not. The only way you can defend a December 25th birthday is by beginning with that as your hypothesis and then endeavoring to prove it, which is not what I'm doing. That is not how historical evidence works. The way it's supposed to work is you start with a blank slate, you examine the evidence, you let the evidence speak for itself and lead you to a conclusion, not here's what I think is happening, and now I'm going to examine the evidence to show. And the funny thing is, you could do it. You could do it in such a way that's like, well, here's my hypothesis. Now let's examine the evidence to see whether it proves or disproves my hypothesis. And if you're honest about it, what would happen is, by examining the evidence, it would be disproven. You'd have to let go of your hypothesis that he was born on December 25th, but they don't do that. They proclaim their hypothesis, and then they examine the evidence, and really only the evidence that suggests he was born on December 25th, which is all from 200 years and later after he was born, which is way more than enough time for error to creep in. So it's not really evidence. What I'm talking about is biblical evidence backed up by historical evidence. So once again, let's start with a quick review of some of the evidence that is in the Bible, corroborated by history, that like I said, we start with a blank slate, we start with a blank canvas, and then we build on the evidence piece by piece and follow it where it leads. Okay. So number one, we learned from the Gospel of Luke that this had to be during the reign of Augustus Caesar. Okay. So that gives us a certain number of years that it had to happen within. Okay. Number two, we are told that it happened in the days of Herod the Great, the Roman appointed king of Judea, a Roman appointee. So it had to be during his lifespan. Now that becomes very critical, because the traditional date of Herod's death that is reported most frequently is in error, okay? From the earliest times until the late 19th century, the preponderance of biblical historians believe that Jesus of Nazareth had to have been born in either 2 or 3 BC. But then in the late 19th century, the eminent German biblical scholar Emil Schur declared that no, Herod died in 4 BC. Therefore, the birth of Christ had to be even earlier than that. But that dominated the biblical scholars and their opinions of the chronology of Christ for about the next 60 years at that point. So from roughly 1900 until about 1960, that was the dominating theory on when Herod died, therefore leading people to believe that Jesus had to have been born earlier than that. That dominated research for a long time. The problem was that is demonstrably false, because it's based on a quotation from Josephus saying that there was an eclipse of the moon shortly before Herod died. And all you have to do is use an astronomy program to look up the eclipses of the moon visible from Judea in about a 7 to 10 year time frame, and say, okay, there was one on this date, one on this date, one on this date, one on this date, and then cross-reference those with the other biblical and historical references to see which one fits. Once again, blank slate, follow the evidence where the evidence leads, not beginning with a conclusion and trying to prove it or even disprove it, but just blank slate and go where the evidence goes. Okay, so the eclipse cited by Emil Schur, he believes was in 4 BC, but the problem with that is that the date of that eclipse compared with the date of Passover that year, they are too close to allow for the list of events also recorded by Josephus that would have had to have fit the chronological timeline between the death of Herod and Passover. There was simply not enough time. There was simply nowhere near enough time for this huge list of events. Actually, it's not a huge list of events. That's the wrong way to say it, but it was a significant list of events that incorporated a lot of time. That's the point. A lot of time is involved. There was no way it all could have been done in as little as 30 days, and that was the time frame in 4 BC that we're talking about. Herod, that eclipse, which again, see, the eclipse was shortly before Herod's death. Now, what does that mean? Okay, does that mean a day, a week, a month? It could be any of those. We don't really know, okay? But the point being is that eats into the amount of time between the eclipse and Passover, because in 4 BC, it was only about 30 days. I don't have the precise number of days in front of me. It's in my notes. Actually, I might be able to find it super quick here. Let's see if I can. If I can find it very, very, very quickly, we'll give it to you here. If not, don't worry about it. Oh yeah, look, I turned right to it in my notes. Very good. So on the 4 BC date, okay, it was, the eclipse occurred on March 13th, and then Passover occurred on April 11th, right? So do the math. That's what, 31, 32 days. That's it, maximum, right? Or it's, just do the math. Not enough time, because that's when the eclipse occurred, right? That doesn't mean that's when Herod died. Herod might have died 7 days later, 10 days later, 2 weeks later, right? So if the eclipse was on March 13th and then Herod died on March 20th, only 7 days, well, now you've only got 3 weeks to cram in all the stuff listed by Josephus that had to have occurred between Herod's death and Passover. Simply not enough time. That eliminates 4 BC as the date of Herod's death. The far better evidence is looking at 1 BC, because in 1 BC, the eclipse was on January 9th or 10th, and then Passover was April 8th of that year. So again, do the math. February, March, April, that's about 90 days, okay? So if the eclipse was on January 9th and 10th, and then Herod died a week later, or even 2 weeks later, even 3 weeks later, if Herod died somewhere around the 1st of February, 3 weeks after the eclipse, you still now have 60, 70 days to get in the events listed by Josephus that had to have occurred between Herod's death and Passover, and bang, you have plenty of time. So that makes 1 BC a far superior date to be looking at when Herod died, and to see if it fits with the other evidence, okay? So once again, number 1, you got the reign of Augustus. Number 2, you've got the reign of Herod that would have ended with his death in 1 BC, okay? Now see, the problem with a 4 BC date is that now you've got to try to fit all of the other evidence that I'm about to mention into a time frame prior to 4 BC. And that's where you run into problems, because there's the other evidence here is we have to look at the decree sent out by Augustus. When did that decree occur, right? So once again, if we use the blank canvas approach and we simply look for any decree that would have went out from Augustus Caesar and go, okay, we found 2 or 3 different decrees, okay, in various years in this general time frame. Well, which one fits? Just asking the open question, which one fits the best? Not trying to make one fit, okay, but which one fits, okay? So the point being is that if you're already committed, there's the word, if you're already committed to the notion that Herod died in 4 BC, well, then you're really only looking at possibilities prior to 4 BC. And therefore, if you don't find one, well, the conclusion you should reach is, okay, something's not right here. I need to re-examine my evidence and consider whether it's accurate if you don't find one. But then if you do find one, does it fit? That's the real question. Does it fit? But what you're doing is you're limiting your search parameters, right? By believing that Herod died in 4 BC. But if you go to 1 BC, right, now you've added about a 3-year period of time to your possible list, your years when you can search, right? You haven't eliminated, because that's the problem with the 4 BC date, is you're eliminating about 3 years of time and saying, well, we can't actually look at that period of time because we're already committed to the notion that Herod died in 4 BC, right? So you've eliminated a big chunk of time from your search and you can't look at it. And that's not really how historical evidence is supposed to work. Plus, not only are we looking at the decree that went out from Caesar, we're also looking at the governorship of Quirinius. We're going to talk about that in a minute. We've also got to look at Zechariah ministering in the temple, right? We also have to look at, several other things to find out, do they fit as well? So it's the only way you can do this and do it right, like I keep saying, is the blank slate approach and looking at the evidence and seeing where all these different pieces overlap. Do they overlap and do they lead us to a certain conclusion? Not am I starting with a premise, a hypothesis, right? And then determining whether I can prove or disprove my hypothesis. The far better way is the blank slate approach and then saying, okay, where does the evidence take me? Okay, so that being said, let's briefly let me talk about that. Okay, so because when you look at the Gospel of Luke, right, and it talks about this decree, right, there's this decree that went out from Augustus Caesar. And the way it is typically translated, we are told that it is either a taxation or a census. Okay. Now, that is not automatically what the word means there. When you look at the Greek word for the word census or taxation, right? See, so Luke chapter 2, verse 1 in the King James reads, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed." So there's that word, right? That's the King James rendering. Now, if you look at the NIV, right, the New International Version, that version translates it this way. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, okay? But the problem is that the Greek word used there is the Greek word apographe, okay? And the Greek word apographe does, although it is not wrong, okay, to translate it taxation, right? Or it's not wrong to translate it census, it doesn't automatically mean either of those. The correct translation of that word, apographe, is that it simply means a registration. Okay. It simply means a registration. So, and we use this kind of thinking in other historical evidence. While a taxation would involve a registration, not every registration involves a taxation, right? Same thing with a census. While a census would involve a registration, not every registration is necessarily a census. Okay. So, and the Romans were experts at both taxation and census taking. When we look at the records we do have of those things, the Romans were really good at it, right? So what we need to do is we need to open up the historical records and say, okay, when and where do we find a taxation and or a census? Or frankly, I said that wrong. When do we find a registration? Not just a census, not just a taxation. When do we find a registration in that general time frame, right? And not limiting our search to only earlier than 4 BC, because that is the problem, okay? See, because now here is the next verse, right? We just said in the days of Augustus Caesar, there went out a decree that all the world should be taxed, right? That's in Luke 2, verse 1. But now in Luke 2, verse 2, we read, and this is the King James rendering, and this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. Now, this verse, okay, and this is where I want to spend some time tonight. This verse is a real problem, okay, because it appears to tell us one thing that it technically is probably not telling us, right? So the first thing we have is that people are familiar with this guy Cyrenius, this Roman official, simply because of the Nativity story. So every year during the holidays, when you go to your church or your school Christmas pageant, and they recite this section of scripture, they mention this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, right? So we focus in on, we find Cyrenius in public documents, in secular historical references, and we go, whoop, there he is, right? And we think we've solved the problem. Well, it's not just that simple. You've got to dig a little bit deeper to make sure you've got the right guy at the right time, because see, that verse tells us he was the governor of Syria. Now, what does all that mean? See, now I was doing some research the other day, because eventually, see, when I first started God Save the King, I was basing it upon some slightly different premises than I am basing it on now, right? Because this all started 35 years ago in the mid 1980s, when I read a book that was entitled at that time, The Birth of Christ Recalculated by Ernest Martin. Okay. Now that book has since been rewritten and retitled. Same author, Ernest Martin, but he updated it and retitled it and republished it. And here it is, right? The Star That Astonished the World by Ernest Martin, right? So The Birth of Christ Recalculated was first published in 1980. This was published in mid 1990s. Let me see if it tells me here real quick. I'll tell you when it was. Second printing, 1998. Okay, so man, 20 years later, updated and republished under a different name. Okay, now that is still one of the best books on the subject. It's not the only one, and it's now been 20 plus years since that was published. There is even more information available to us now, but that is a great place to start. That book is a fantastic place to start your research into this subject. Okay. But at that time, right, and I've mentioned this in other segments, what I thought was that the date changed, but that the story didn't change, right? And over 35 years of research, bit by bit, line by line, layer by layer, the proverbial onion illustration, the layers got peeled away, and I went, oh my word, no, 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 no. The story does change. The story changes, frankly, pretty dramatically as you start to discover different pieces of the puzzle that contribute to the overall story, right? And so once again, this is one of them, is this guy named Quirinius. Now, I'm pronouncing his name that way deliberately because of how we read it in the King James. Now, what the point I was making is that, okay, let me get there. I'm rabbit trailing, but I'm reminding myself of my own rabbit trails. So, like I said, when I first started this research, the premise, okay, because it was me and frankly, my brother Dan and some other men who were all reading the same book, we all had the same idea in our head. How do we tell the traditional nativity story when it's a story everybody already knows, not realizing that the story really isn't the way we thought? The traditional nativity story, which really goes back to two primary sources. It goes back to a source called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is an apocryphal book written in about 200 AD that is utterly unreliable historically. There is no reason to believe anything the Proto-Evangelium of James says. Now, I know that there's going to be people out there that they're going to be very upset about that. But the reason I say that, the Proto-Evangelium of James is not all that long. You can read the entire thing in about 20 minutes. And all you need to do is take the facts that directly concern the Nativity, set them aside for a minute, and look at the other facts that are listed in that book. It's not long enough to really be a book. That document, look at the other facts and examine whether they are correct or not. And they are consistently incorrect. The facts that aren't about the nativity are incorrect. So if the facts that do not directly relate to the nativity are incorrect, why should we believe the facts about the nativity? Okay. There's no reason we should. Okay. And the primary one is the fact that the author, because we don't know who the author is, and that starts with the fact that it's an apocryphal book. It's a pseudepigraphal book, right? Because the author claims to be James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, that's the very last verse, is the author claims to be James, the brother of Jesus. But by simply, because here you go, this is how evidence works. This is how you analyze evidence. When we analyze how the language is being used, it was clearly not written during the lifetime of James. It was written about 150 years later, based upon how the language is used. So it can't be written by James if it was written 150 years after he died. Well, that's a big problem right there, because then why is the author claiming that it was written by James? That is a huge check mark right there. That's a huge red flag going, wait a second, time out. You're claiming to be James, the Lord's brother, and rather obviously the reason they're claiming that is they're hoping that that gives them credibility. But when you get caught in a lie like that, the credibility goes the other way. It goes in reverse. Now you've got to dig even deeper in order for me to give you any credit whatsoever as to why your document has historical credibility, right? So as I started to say, when you look at what is in the Proto-Evangelium of James, really didn't intend to go here tonight, but we're here, right? And like I said, when you look at the non-nativity facts, they tend to do with the geography in and around Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and they tend to deal with activities, social norms and activities in and around the temple. And the activities they try to tell you existed in and around the temple simply would not have been the case. See, and this is very interesting because if you're looking at 200 AD, right? See, the temple's not standing anymore, right? The temple is not standing anymore. It's been plowed under by the Romans. First from the first war between the Jews and the Romans between 66 and 70 AD, but then in about 135 AD, right, where the Romans were so upset with the Jews that they just leveled the city entirely, and so the temple's not standing. So whoever the author is of the Proto-Evangelium, he's never been there. He's clearly never been to Bethlehem or Jerusalem because he doesn't know the geography and he doesn't know the social norms, the cultural norms of what could and could not happen in that place and time. So there's just no reason to believe them. Also, to be blunt, when you read it, there's clearly an agenda to the Proto-Evangelium. He's trying to build a case for a certain type of evidence, right? He's trying to build a case for something in particular that he's trying to prove a point that's totally unrelated. So he's trying to make his case for something completely unrelated. I won't talk about that tonight. We'll go there some other time if we need to, right? So like I keep saying, because of the non-nativity information is so recklessly inaccurate, there is no reason to believe the nativity information. There's no credibility there whatsoever. So even the most benign fact that maybe could be correct, okay, we have to question it. So here's the perfect example. This is the source of the tradition that Mary rode on the back of a donkey when very pregnant, like in labor pregnant, okay, which that doesn't make sense. Why would you put, and it even says she jumped down off the donkey. No, I don't think so. Even by the stretch that she would have been riding a donkey, she certainly wouldn't have jumped down off the donkey, right? And then likewise in the Proto-Evangelium of James, that's where we get the notion that she delivered the same night that Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem. And the Bible plainly tells us that that wasn't the case, right? In the I need to do a whole separate one on the Proto-Evangelium of James. We're told that Mary was publicly discovered and that she and Joseph were charged with a crime. Okay, just utterly ridiculous stuff that could not be true. It's not possible for it to be true. So anyway, that is one of the sources of the traditional story, and it's full of holes. It's full of enormous holes. Another source of the traditional story comes about 1,000 years later when St. Francis of Assisi put together one of the first ever living nativity scenes. Now, of course, he is basing what he knows and understands on about 800 years worth of telling the nativity story a certain way. So he has no real reason to challenge that. He's not doing his due diligence to look at the history. He's going on what he knows, which is Joseph and Mary, back of a donkey, born in a cave, blah, 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 right? So he does the first ever nativity scene and first ever nativity play performed for the laity, performed by the laity for the laity, right? Because up until then, all nativity plays were performed by the clergy during the Mass, okay, in the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern church. That was how it was done. So this was the first. So the one thing that's cool about St. Francis is that he really did want the Nativity to be more accessible. He wanted people to understand it better because he wanted to make it something real that the laity could relate to, because it really was, about every man. Okay. But those two sources in particular have ingrained the traditional story in our heads. And unfortunately, they're just incorrect. Okay. So like I said, back to when I first started this research, what I was thinking in my head was, well, the date is different, but the story isn't really different. Okay. So therefore, the process going on in my head was, well, how do we tell the story? How do I tell the story? How do we tell the story in a way that'll make it exciting for people? Kind of like what St. Francis was thinking was, how do I make this story interesting? Because everybody thinks they know it. Everybody knows the story already. Jesus and Mary, back of a donkey, arrive in Bethlehem. She's ready to deliver any second. There's no room in the local motel. The evil innkeeper throws them out and says, you can't stay here, but you can use the stable. You can use the barn behind the inn. And so it may not be, much, but at least it's some type of shelter on a cold winter night. Okay. All of which is incorrect. It's all incorrect. They didn't arrive the same day she delivered. There's no inn. There's no motel involved. Okay. There's no stable involved. There's no innkeeper. None of those things are actually in the nativity story in the Bible. Right now, it took me years to discover that. Once again, it's the layers of the onion, like I said, right? The overused metaphor, right? The proverbial layers of the onion coming off and going, oh my word, this is so different. This is so different, right? So now over time, I don't use the exact same perspective I used to. I have divided this into 3 different perspectives, which is to look at it from the perspective of the Judeans, right? And I simply call this the Judean Chronicle, right? Then I also want to look at it from the perspective of the Parthians, the Parthian Empire, which means the Magi, right? That is the Parthian Chronicle. And then lastly, we look at it from the perspective of the Romans, which is the Roman Chronicle. So, geez, I just took this huge rabbit trail to bring you back to this point. I was doing some additional research on the Parthian Chronicle the other day, and I was looking at the fact that we need to sort through all of these references that we think we know what they mean. Okay. Because I'm back to Luke 2:2 right now at this moment. And this taxing was made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, that looks like that is a statement that we ought to be able to look that up. And if we find something that even generically matches, bingo, we have found what we're looking for, right? Well, it's not quite that easy, right? Because you got the guy's name, Quirinius, you've got his title or office. He's a governor, and we're told where? In Syria, right? See, so what I was looking at the other day as I was working on the Parthian Chronicle is I literally was looking at the word Syria, right? I was doing some background work on the meaning of the word Syria, the etymology of the word Syria and where it came from, right? Because Syria, okay, is a contraction, a shortening of the word Assyria, right? Assyria, Assyria, right? So Syria is a contraction of Assyria, and Assyria is the name of an ancient Upper Mesopotamian empire named after the Mesopotamian god Assur, Assur, okay? Or Asher, Ashur, 2 different spellings, same name, Asher or Assur, and then Assyria, right? Okay, would simply be telling us that it's the land of the god Assur or Asher, right? So you've got, and here's the funny part, is you had the city of Assur, then you had the region of Assur, and then you've got the god Assur, right? So when you would read the label Assyria, you actually have to keep all three things in mind. You have to keep in mind that it's the name of a god, it's the name of the city devoted to the god, and then it's the name of the geographic region that is controlled or ruled. That's the better word. That is ruled by that god. So now we have this label popping up again. But in this context, it's referring to the Roman province of Assyria, right? Now it's going to be the same generic geographical location as the province of Assyria, but it is not exactly the same thing, right? Did I say that right? It's going to be the same general geographic region as the empire of Assyria, but this is the Roman province of Assyria in the late 1st century BC. So that means the equivalent of modern day Lebanon, Syria, the modern country of Syria, but then it would also include southeastern Turkey, and then northern Iraq, and even a little bit of northwestern Iran. That's the area that we're talking about. So when you look up these historical records, one of the things you discover is, it's trying to tell us that this man Quirinius, right, was the governor of the Roman province of Syria. That's what it looks like it means. So, okay, well, that should be easy to find, right? So when we go back and look in the Roman records, we do find that Quirinius was the governor of Roman Syria. He was. But here's the problem. He was the governor of Roman Syria in 6 AD, the year 6 AD. So we are at least 6, 7, maybe even 10 years off. That's a problem. That's a legitimate problem. See, and critics of Christianity, okay, love to point to this factoid and go, see, no reason to believe it. There's no reason for us to believe in the historical validity of the Bible because it's clearly wrong. They love to claim that on this one fact. Okay. Problem is, to them, that's good enough. They've disproven it in their minds. So they leave it alone and say, nope, we're not going any further. We're not going to look any further. I have proven my point, and that's all I need to do. We're not going to look any further. But the problem is if you look deeper, you do find that there is strong evidence that this verse is still absolutely correct. Okay. So the first thing we need to point out is the fact that there is a better spelling. Okay. King James Quirinius, Cyrenius. Much better spelling is Quirinius, Quirinius. Publius Sulpicius Quirinius would have been his Latin name, right? And there's actually very good secular resources about this man and what it was, okay? Or who he was, rather. So like I said, back to the register. See, because we're told, Luke 2:2, that this registration was made when Quirinius was governor of Syria, of the Roman province of Syria. But when we look for the official governorship of Quirinius in Roman Syria, that is about 7 years after, 7 to 10, actually 10 years is the better point. It's really about 10 years later than our target, right? See, and this is exactly what I mean. What I was driving at earlier is that when we examine the evidence, you can't force it, right? So if I had nowhere else to turn, if this was all the evidence that I had, like I said about the critics of the Bible, right? if this is the only evidence available to you, they're not necessarily incorrect. They're reaching a semi-legitimate conclusion here, because if that's what's being referenced, the dates don't line up. The dates don't line up. And based on that evidence alone, you got a problem. You've got a problem. But when we dig deeper, we find some interesting evidence. So for one thing, when we look at the word for governor, right? It's not the typical word for a governor, right? So like when we look up later in the gospel stories and we look up Pilate, Pontius Pilate, right? And we are told that he is the governor of Judea, okay? We are told that he is the hegemon, okay? Hegemon. He is the governor of Judea. That is the traditional word that is used for a governor, right? But when we look it up in the when we look up what's in Luke 2:2, it's the Greek word hegemonuo. Okay, so one is a noun, the other is a verb. Okay, so we're not told that he is the governor. We are told that he is one who governs. All right, that's the difference. The noun means he's the governor. That's Pontius Pilate. The other is we are told he is one who governs, or a governor, a hegemonuo. Okay, so that's a big difference, because now we don't have to look for the title governor. We have to look for someone who is in a position of authority, right? Because when we look at the time in question, we actually find that there is a different man entirely, right? The procurator of Judea, which was part of Roman Syria at that time, was a man named Sentius Saturnius, right? And that one's clear as a bell. He was the governor of Roman Syria at that time. So once again, if you're a critic of this, you're going to look at that and go, see, problem solved. The evidence doesn't match up. We're done, right? So see, and that's, you can see how people jump to conclusions very quickly. But if we slow down and we, again, sorry, I'm going to overuse the illustration, but if we slow down and we peel the onion one layer at a time, what we've got to do is go, okay, well, if he's not the governor, he's a governor, right? How does that work? Okay. And does that fit? Because if it doesn't, okay, then we got a problem. But if it does, that's something different entirely, right? So part of what's really interesting here is we have a fragment from Quirinius's tomb, right? This is a guy we actually know a fairly large amount about, okay? And this fragment is currently in the Vatican Museum. It was discovered in Tivoli, right? And where we found his tomb, right? And this inscription reads that Quirinius, here we go, was for the second time legate of the deified Augustus with pro-praetorian authority in Syria and Phoenicia. Okay? Now, what's interesting is it says, this particular inscription says, was for the second time legate of the deified Augustus, right? Now, deified Augustus, that's a reference to Caesar Augustus and that he was a living God, the deified Augustus, okay? But it says, take note that this says that he was a legate, okay? A legatus Augusti, okay? And that it was the second time he was legatus Augusti, okay? The second time, right? Whereas the record in Luke says this taxation was first made when Quirinius was governor of Syria. In other words, indicating it looks like there was a prior time when Quirinius was a governor. In other words, a legatus Augusti in Syria. It looks like he did the job twice, and that the second time is the record of 6 AD, right? That's actually recorded in the book of Acts, right? We know about that one, now that's interesting because that is verified. That is cross-referenced in the book of Acts. It's right there. Okay. So once again, if we look at other information about Quirinius, here's something else we discover. We have found another inscription, a second inscription that kind of clarifies matters even more. It's on the tombstone of a man named Quintus Aemilius Secundus, and we are told that he was a prefect of a cohort in the First Augustan Legion. And then in his inscription, it mentions that he served under Quirinius. There you go. He served under Quirinius, who was Caesar's legate in Syria. Okay. But the actions of Quintus Aemilius Secundus that are recorded here, they correspond to the earlier time. In other words, the activities that are recorded there don't line up with the second usage of Quirinius being the legate in Syria. They line up with the first time he was the legate in Syria, legatus, right? So in other words, he was a governor, not the governor, a governor in Roman Syria twice. Once, apparently in the time frame we're looking at, and then the second time was in 6 AD, which is the one that it gets confused with every once in a while. So when we look at his governorship and we look at the records of what he did, what his titles were, and stuff like that, what we discover is that his governorship of Syria at the time mentioned by Luke was not a standard issue governorship. He was not the governor of Roman Syria. Like I've already said already, that was Sentius Saturnius, right? But that what he was is that he was legatus Augusti, okay, an Augustus, a legate appointed directly by Augustus and reporting. This is interesting. See, he would have reported directly to Augustus, meaning he actually would have outranked the governor of Syria, right? That's very, very provocative, very interesting, right? And it's highly probable that he was known as the Orienti Praepostus. So what that means is he was essentially the Roman commander-in-chief of that entire region, which means he definitely outranked Saturnius. He definitely outranked Saturnius. So the irony is that this actually lines up and makes a tremendous degree of sense. That this is the governorship of Quirinius, and it is actually taking place at the time frame that we are questioning, right? So the problem, part of it is in how it's translated into the English, right? Because you do have some issues there with the English translation. The fact that it says the taxation, right? It's not just a taxation, it's a registration, right? And if this is the registration that lines up with the festival of Concordia in 2 BC, and therefore the oath of allegiance that had to be sworn to Augustus Caesar, now it actually lines up just fine. It makes complete sense that this, pardon me, that this registration would have been overseen by Quirinius. Now it makes complete sense because he would have been the man ultimately responsible for making sure this happened in the Roman Eastern provinces and client kingdoms that would have included, quote unquote, Roman Judea, which was part of Roman Syria, even though it was not officially a Roman province just yet. It was simply a Roman client kingdom. That wouldn't come until a few years later, after Herod the Great has died, and then after his son was actually deposed by Augustus, his replacement, okay, um, Herod Archelaus. Herod Archelaus did not really do a very good job. He was deposed by Augustus in 6 AD, and that was when Judea officially became a part of Roman Syria as a Roman province, and that is actually when Quirinius was appointed the governor, hegemon, and it's used accurately at that in that record. He is called the governor, the hegemon, not just one who governs, hegemonuo, right? And also he did conduct a census at that time. So that's part of why that's so confusing, is because he was the governor of Roman Syria. He did conduct a census, but that was all in 6 AD. But that's not the one we're looking at. We're looking at the same man at a different time, held a different role, and actually conducted a different registration. But it's all historically confirmed. It's just a couple layers deep. So if you're not looking at it the right way, you won't find it. Just that simple. So what you got to do now is you have to go back to Luke chapter 2, verse 2, and frankly, you've got to retranslate it. The way it should have been translated is it should read, "This was the first registration held by Quirinius during his times governing Roman Syria." Okay. And so we're out of time. We're going to leave it right there. I hope that was really helpful to you guys that are really interested in this study the same way I am, which is to dig deep and find out details about what the nativity of Jesus of Nazareth really would have looked like. And what better time of year to do it than this, when everybody is focused on nativity, and what an opportunity for us to shine some light on it and say, hey, look, I know that you think the tradition looks like this, but the reality probably looks like this, right? So God save the king. Maybe the nativity didn't look quite like we think it did. Okay. So once again, my name is Tim Keyes for GodSaveTheKing.org here on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can listen to the show every Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for listening. Please join me next week again for God Save the King.